All right, let's get started. So guys, today is the last day of the training, and we have a couple of administrative topics remaining that we need to cover today. And I shared the agenda with you yesterday that what we will be covering today. Other than covering the topics, we will have a quick assessment, probably at 11. And after that, I will be sharing a couple of documents and I will explain what those documents are and how they will help you in future while working with Sentinel. In fact, not with Sentinel only, while working with any SIEM and SOAR solution, any cloud native SIEM and SOAR solution. It will also equally help you with on-premises solutions. However, I would rather not recommend continue working with on-premises solution because most of the leaders, when it comes to SIEM and SOAR, they have already started providing SaaS services, which means you already have a ready-made version available of those products in cloud. Example, Splunk. It provides Splunk Enterprise Security, which is a SaaS version of Splunk. So similarly, slowly and gradually, these security monitoring operations or security monitoring solutions, they are being made available in cloud as SaaS functionality, which basically means that you don't need to deploy anything. You don't need to configure the infrastructure. All you need to do is sign up and then start ingesting logs from various data sources and start analyzing those logs and start hunting for threats. So that's what those documents will help you with. So let's just log into a respective Azure subscription. Meanwhile, other participants will join. Okay. So I was on page over here. Now you can see my ID, which is this ID raghu.19852006@hotmail.com. It's a Microsoft ID, though it's a personal ID. My ID has access to multiple directories. Directories represent a tenant, and tenant could belong to an organization. An organization may have one tenant or multiple tenants, or a customer may have one tenant or multiple tenants. So my ID has access to all of these tenants. Let's say I want to do something in ABB directory. Then I will switch directory. I'll switch to ABB. And now it will redirect me to ABB's directory, and whatever subscription in ABB's directory, I have access to all of those subscriptions, and basis on the level of access that my ID has been granted to in those subscription, I will see the resources and be able to work with those resources accordingly. Since we follow the zero trust architecture, I will only be granted access to the subscription when I need to provide them some assistance, some guidance, some consulting. And while it is not needed, once that meeting is over, once that assignment is over, they would remove my identity from their subscriptions. So which means my user will continue to exist in their directory, and that is why I'm able to see their directories. However, they will remove my access from the subscription. So that is why you can see right now I'm in ABB's directory. However, I don't have access to a subscription. It says you don't have a subscription. Why? Because this is how I basically provide consulting on security. I always request my customer to remove my access from their subscription when I'm not working with them, so that there is absolutely no question of compromise. They can only let my user account, my identity retained in their directory, but remove my access. Whenever they need me to do something, they'll quickly go to their specific subscription IAM, and they will grant me access to that specific subscription. That's how the arrangement works. Now, what is this arrangement? This arrangement that I've just shown you is for an individual. This is an individual providing consulting to customers. This is the use case for an individual. What about for an organization? What about for an organization or an MSP, which is managed service provider, or MSSP, managed security service provider? How are they going to manage the customers? Can they use the same format, the one that I was just showing you for an individual, for myself? No, that will not make sense, because when it comes to an MSSP, you have a contract, and that contract is typically either for operations, that is for consulting, that is for architecture, implementation, or any other service, or let's say NOC operations, SOC operations, etc. So you have a contract, and that contract has a validity, it has a lifeline. While that contract is live, the MSSP will continue to retain the access. So it cannot happen that customer will, on need basis, grant MSSP access to their account and subscriptions. It will be permanent. It will be permanent till the time that contract is live, depending on what that contract is. So that's how it happens for the organization. And that is why we cannot follow the same process that we have used for an individual. The process that has been used for this individual, it cannot be followed in the same manner for this organization. For organization, it will be a different process. Am I making sense, guys?
Yes.
Okay. Why it will be a different process for organization? There is another reason, because when I say organization, I'm talking about multiple employees. I'm talking about 20, 30, 100 people, depending on how big your operations is. So if you have delegated 100 employees from your team to support a customer, and if that support is typically during the business hours from 9 in the morning till 6 in the evening, will your customer be adding your 100 employees ID every day at 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the morning and then removing it at 6 o'clock in the evening? That's not possible. Or the customer will say, any which ways these people will come tomorrow, so let's not remove their access. But over the weekend, since nobody is working, it's 5-day operations, will they be removing all the IDs? It will be a cumbersome task. So that is why I said the process cannot be the same, an individual versus an organization. So there is a separate process for access management. Access management across tenant. Now, when I say across tenant, for example, DXC has a tenant. So DXC has an Azure Active Directory tenant. And in that Azure Active Directory tenant, DXC has its users identity stored and maintained. All the DXC users means employees, not all the employees, not all are working in cloud domain or cloud business unit. So whosoever is working in cloud, uh, they have a user identity stored and maintained in Azure AD. Similarly, customer, which is ABC, has its users identity stored and maintained in their Azure Active Directory. Whatever Active Directory they use, they have it in their Active Directory. So customer ABC also has its user identity stored, maintained in an AAD, Azure Active Directory. Now these two Active Directories are identical. They are isolated by design. Microsoft has created directory structure in such a manner that this Active Directory belonging to DXC cannot speak to this Active Directory belonging to customer ABC. They are running in isolation. So if these directories cannot talk to each other, how will you provide access? How will this customer ABC provide access to 100 employees of DXC to their directory so that these employees can manage the projects or operations at customer's end? That is my another question. Now, for an individual, how the access was provided? For an individual, the access was provided in the customer's tenant via guest account. So a guest account is created in customer's tenant for the individual, and the guest account has been provided some access, some RBAC, and the individual is able to manage the customer's account. That's what happens for the individual. But when it comes to 100 employees, 200 employees, 500 employees, you cannot create guest account because guest account brings its own security loopholes, security challenges. Guest accounts are managed by their respective directory. Now let's say if I have an ID, if I have an ID that ends with Gmail, or if I have an ID from Yahoo, and if I give this ID to my customer will add my Gmail ID or my Yahoo ID to their Active Directory. And their Active Directory will not be able to authenticate Gmail and Yahoo because Gmail and Yahoo uses a separate directory. They use their own directory. So it will be a cumbersome process to ensure authentication and authorization in the long run. One individual versus 100 employees. If there is one individual, you can still manage. But if there are 100 employees, it becomes very difficult. So that is why we need to look for a separate arrangement. So what I'm showing you on the screen here, which says switch directory, all of these directories, this is an individual arrangement. I have been granted access to these directories as an individual in their respective account and subscription. That is how I have got access. Okay. So for and company, there's a different process, and I'll talk about that process. But I wanted you to first understand that how it happens for an individual, or what is the easiest method of granting somebody access to your account. So if I want to grant somebody access to my, let's say, lab account, it will be very easy for me. If I want somebody access to my account, what I will do, the very first thing that I will do, I will create an identity for that person in my account. And we covered it in the very beginning, I'm saying in the first few days when we built the lab environment. So we'll create an identity. So what I'll do, I will create a new user and I will create a user as a guest user, right? So I'll create a guest user over here, not here. This is invite external user. So I will click on invite external user, and here I type the user ID. So let's say if this is how you invite. You just type the email address of the user here. So you will type the user email address. You will type the display name for the user, whatever name you want to type. You will type the invite message. Recipient, if you want user's manager to also get notification or your manager to also get notification, you will type CC. Provide all the information for the user. Usage location, which is mandatory. So you provide the usage location and the remaining of the information, which is optional. And then you will provide some access to this user. For example, I'm inviting this user and I want this user to have some level of access in my directory. I'll select the role, for example, global reader I want to provide to this user. And then I will hit review plus invite. When I hit review plus invite, an invitation will be sent to the user. And this user identity will be created in my account. So you can see user identity is created. Let me refresh it. You will see it. So here's the user identity over here. This is the user identity, Raghuveer Singh, and you can see it says gmail.com. This is the user identity that has been created. Now, whenever this user needs to sign in to my account, the user will only use their ID, which is raghu.19852006 @gmail.com. And what will happen? Microsoft will then manage authentication and authentication with Gmail directory services, with Google directory service. So every time this user is trying to sign in, Microsoft is managing the authentication with Gmail directory service. Once the authentication is done, then the user will be authorized based on what access user has been granted to. Now, this is possible for one user, but not for 100 users, because this poses a security risk also. What if this user identity is compromised? If this user identity is compromised, then if you have granted contributor access to this user in your account, imagine the level of damage that can happen. And you absolutely have no control on this identity because it's a guest identity. So that is why following this method for 100 users, for 200 users, for a permanent, for a specific duration of time, which ranges in months and year, is not recommended, right? So this is not recommended. We need to look for a different option. So keep this thought in mind, that what will be the best approach to grant access to the service provider's employee in my directory, in my tenant, or in my subscription. That's the question that I'm leaving you with. So keep that question in mind. Now let's come back to the Log Analytics workspace. So we are back to Log Analytics workspace, and we see here that we have multiple workspaces. However, if I navigate to Sentinel, I will see that in the Sentinel, I will only have one workspace here. Now, there is a high probability that I have also configured log ingestion in these two workspaces. Right now, my use case is that a customer has multiple workspaces. This is my use case that I'm working with. So it is the same customer who has multiple workspaces. Now, how do I, and all of these workspaces they have log ingested into them. They have data sources configured to them. So definitely I would like that those data sources or the logs coming from those data sources in these two workspaces, test workspace 1 and test workspace 2, to be also analyzed by Sentinel. And for that, I will need to add those workspaces to Sentinel also. Okay, so let's add those workspaces to Sentinel. So how do we add? We'll hit create and we'll select the workspace. Now, if you notice, you can only add a workspace at a time. You cannot select both the workspaces at the same time. Why? Because when you add a workspace to a Sentinel, Sentinel also creates a record of it in its internal databases, whatever Sentinel uses in the backend, which is definitely SQL database from Microsoft. So Sentinel creates a reference of the workspace in its database. It has to create some configuration. That is why you cannot add multiple workspaces at the same time. It has to be one workspace at a time. So let's say I will add test workspace 1 first. I'm adding this workspace in Sentinel.
Raghu, where we need to navigate to add this workspace?
Just click on create. I'm saying over here on the top, it says in Sentinel create. When you hit create, you will get an option to add workspace to Sentinel.
Okay.
All right. So my first workspace is added, test workspace is added. Now that the workspace is added, if I refresh the screen, that workspace will disappear. Sentinel already knows how many workspaces are added to me. So if I refresh the screen, the workspace 1 got disappeared. Why it got disappeared? Because now it is reflecting here. If I refresh the screen, it will reflect here. So now 2 workspaces are added to Sentinel, or Sentinel has been added to 2 workspaces, whatever language you want to use. Okay. I want to add another workspace also, which is test workspace 2. So I will add test workspace 2 also. Now I have added test workspace 2 also. So now I have 3 workspaces in Sentinel. I'll refresh it. Okay, you can see I have 3 workspaces in Sentinel. Now, if I go to, now whenever I need to go inside Sentinel, I need to select a workspace, right? So Sentinel gives me a capability to work with multiple workspaces at a time. You know, at a time with multiple or one at a time. Both options are there. If I want to work with one workspace at a time, then I will select that workspace. I will just click on that workspace and I will see Sentinel for that workspace. This is Sentinel for this workspace. And you can see for this workspace also, Sentinel has been activated because Sentinel service is individual for each workspace, is identical. So this workspace Sentinel has been added. However, in this workspace, you don't see anything.
Yeah, but Raghu, for multiple workspace, like I want to add multiple workspace to a single Sentinel, that is possible or not?
It's a single Sentinel. It's a single Sentinel for you. For a customer, it's a single Sentinel. It is just the arrangement for the billing. Sentinel cannot bill you for a workspace that has not been added or that has been added mid-month. That is why I said you add one workspace at a time to Sentinel so that it will manage its data in the backend, it will manage its references in the backend, and it will know that from where I need to start billing for this workspace, right? So we add one workspace at a time, but all of these workspaces are now part of Sentinel. And Sentinel is just one service for me as a customer. For example, I'm a sponsorship pass customer. Sentinel is just one service for me. When I get the billing, I'll get the billing on pay as you go basis or pro rata basis, which basically means that if Sentinel hyphen law workspace has been added from 17th of July last month, my billing will start from 17th of July. If test workspace 1 and 2 has been added on August 4th today, then I will have my billing started from August 4th. That is the only difference. However, it is just one service, Sentinel, and it's a SaaS service. You have not built it for yourself. It is with Microsoft. Microsoft has given you a tenant of that service so that you can use this service to manage the security affairs of your organization. Make sense?
Still not 100% clear. Okay. I want to do monitoring. So these are three different workspace or yes, workspace. So in which Sentinel I have to go for the monitoring?
That's what I'm coming up to. Okay.
Okay.
So now that we have 3 workspaces in Sentinel, as long as we had one workspace, life was very smooth. We were able to manage everything. Life was smooth. But now that we have 3 workspaces, does it mean that I will need to build my infrastructure all over again? So my question is that when I had one workspace, I'm saying when you had one workspace or when you started with your first workspace, there's a high probability you will not have all the workspaces added from day one. So when you had your first workspace onboarded in Sentinel, what you did, you basically followed all the phases: collect, detect, investigate, and respond. And then it is a continuous process. So I'm saying you're managing Sentinel for one workspace. You've already configured all the log sources, data connectors. You've configured the analytics rule and hunting queries. You've got some incidents. You are investigating the incidents. You have created some playbooks for automation using Logic App, and you have integrated those playbooks in your analytics rule also. And while investigating the incidents, your SOC engineers can also make use of those playbooks, and it's a continuous process. Continuous process basically means that you will continue to work with these phases tomorrow there is a probability that customer onboards a third-party application for which the data connector is available. You will start with the collect phase. You will install that data collector and install the solution from Content Hub. Then you will enable appropriate analytics rule, custom as well as out of the box, and the incidents will start to come to that solution. Your engineers will start to work on those incidents, and you would also have some runbooks created, automation created for those incidents. So it's a continuous process when you have first workspace or only workspace in the Sentinel. Now let's take a step ahead. Now you have another workspace that you need to add. Another workspace, and my use case is from the same customer. Right now, everything from the same customer. Then we'll go to across customer. So from now I've got another workspace that I need to onboard to Sentinel. Another workspace to be onboarded into Sentinel. This is my use case. So what will I be doing? How do I onboard? I have already shown you that how do we onboard. You just need to navigate to Sentinel, hit select create. It will populate all the workspaces, and you will just need to select the workspace and it will be added to Sentinel, onboarded to Sentinel. So this part is completed. The workspace is onboarded to Sentinel. But what next? The question is, how will I manage the incidents for this workspace? How will I manage everything? See, when it comes to the data collection, obviously, when you are adding a workspace, it basically means that it already has log sources, data sources, ingesting logs into it, ingesting logs and events into it. That part is already done because that's prior to adding the workspace. You don't add a workspace and then you start with log ingestion. No, that's not the right approach. You will unnecessarily pay more money. Why you will pay more money? Because the cost of a workspace is half. When you onboard it to Sentinel, it is double. Sentinel doesn't have a separate pricing. It is pricing based on the workspace. So whatever is the workspace pricing plus some additional markup on it is the Sentinel cost. So if I understand it from this manner, you will understand it better. So let's say I create another workspace. And that is why we did that entire exercise on day 1, 2, and 3 when we were trying to build the lab. We were trying to build the environment. We did not start, I did not even talk about Sentinel or showed you the Sentinel portal till the first few days. Though the training was for Sentinel and you were wondering that why are we not talking about Sentinel? Because Sentinel comes later. First, you need to have an environment. And since this training started from scratch, I did not have subscriptions enabled for you and had my team member Nitesh create a full-fledged log ingestion environment for you. Then you would not have understood the background process. So that is why we started from scratch. Now, if I create a new log analytics workspace today, let's say I'm creating another workspace, which is test workspace. So another test workspace. P. Okay, my another workspace is created. I'll navigate to log analytics workspaces. Now you will understand why you should not onboard a workspace to Sentinel without 100% confirming that workspace has all the data sources, log sources, ingesting data into it. This is the reason. So if I go to this workspace and look at the cost of this workspace, look at the plan that I currently have on this workspace. My plan is per pay-as-you-go plan. And in this plan, I'm paying around 180 GB, I'm sorry, 118 Indian National Rupees INR for per GB of data ingestion. This is per GB I pay 180 rupees per month. This is per month. And basic log, so there are two types of log ingestion. One is analytics log data injection and basic log data ingestion. So this is my cost for log ingestion right now when I have a workspace only. This is the cost that I have. Okay. Now let's remember these numbers. 180 rupees, 39 rupees. This is the cost of my workspace when it is individual, when it is not added to Sentinel. Now let's look at the cost of the workspace, the one which is added to Sentinel. So test workspace 2 is added to Sentinel, right? Let's look at the cost of it. If I go to the cost of test workspace 2, it will not show me the cost. It will say, you know what? You are now part of Sentinel. Please go to Sentinel to see your cost. So it says this log analytics workspace has Microsoft Sentinel enabled. The pricing tier for this workspace can be changed in the Sentinel pricing page. And the current pricing tier, and you see what it says. The current Sentinel pricing tier is pay as you go. Okay. So this workspace has Sentinel pricing tier. Now let's see what is the pricing of this workspace. So what I'll do, I'll click on this workspace and it will give me the Sentinel. I'll go to Sentinel console. And in the Sentinel console, I'll click on this workspace to see its pricing. And I'll click on settings at the bottom under configuration. Here I'll see the pricing of this workspace. Let's see the pricing of this workspace, which is here. This is the pricing of the workspace. Look at the pricing and compare it now. What was the pricing when the workspace was not added to Sentinel? What is the pricing when the workspace is added to Sentinel? Can somebody tell me what is the difference in pricing now? Okay.
Almost 150 rupees.
It's almost double. It's almost double the price, right? 70-80% increase in the price. Now tell me one thing. If you are implementing Microsoft Sentinel for a customer, so you're part of a Sentinel deployment plan, and you have 4 weeks to ingest, test, you have 4 weeks of phase to identify, ingest, configure, and test, log in, test data sources to workspace. 4 weeks of time you will take to do all of this, all of this part, and another 2 weeks to configure Sentinel. Which means in this 2 week, you will be configuring the detect and remediate phase, which is configuring all the solutions, installing all the solutions, configuration, connecting the data connectors, configuration of analytics rule, writing logic app custom, creating custom connectors and all that. Now, imagine if I had created 4 weeks to identify, 4 weeks to identify the data sources, ingest logs. Imagine if on 1st of the month, if I had added Sentinel to the workspace, I had added Sentinel to the workspace that I will use the entire month to ingest logs, to configure logs, to test logs, to do all my implementation tasks before I start to work with Sentinel. What will happen? You will make your customer pay unnecessarily for this time frame because Sentinel is not even doing anything in this phase. In the first line, you are still trying to identify that what all data sources are available at customer's place. How are you going to ingest logs from those data sources? What strategy are you going to follow? Whether you will have one workspace or multiple workspaces. Then you create workspace or workspaces, and then you start to ingest data. For testing, you can use KQL queries inside the workspace itself to do the testing. So Sentinel is actually not needed at this phase. But what you did, you onboarded the workspace on day 1 in Sentinel. Now, by the time you reach to Sentinel, you would have unnecessarily paid to Microsoft double the price, almost 80% extra. Double the price, and that money goes from your customer's pocket. That is why when this entire training is done in a manner as if we are working in a customer facing deployment project, both from administrative as well as operational perspective. This is how I delivered the entire training. And that is why we spent the initial 5 days, the first 2 days in basics, and the next 3 days in configuring the prerequisites for Sentinel. And then on day 6, I had you enable Sentinel servers. This was the reason. Now, some people got the answer of the question that they had in mind, that why did we waste 5 days when this training was for Sentinel? This was the reason. I wanted you to understand the costing part, which is very important. You could be a greatest architect, greatest technology person on this planet, but if you don't know how to save cost, trust me, nobody will like you. I take pride in the fact that we were able to send, space shuttle, I'm saying that shuttle Chandrayaan, at the cost of less than per kilometer cost of an auto fare in the moon, in the very first attempt from India. I take pride in that fact. And when the Honorable Prime Minister came on stage and announced it, this is how he announced it. He said that we were able to build this project. The cost of this project is less than per kilometer cost of an auto or an Uber cab. So he talked about cost because that is very important for any project, for any implementation. At the end of the day, it is money that we are dealing with. You are getting salary from your company is getting payment from the customers, and customer is also managing cost at the end of the day. So cost is very important for an architect. If you don't bother about cost, you cannot become a good architect. Take my words today. And if you have not bothered about cost so far, start bothering about cost from today onwards. Think about cost always, whether it is your department or not your department. Always ask the right question. Always look for the opportunity to save cost for your client. Trust me, they'll come back to you for another deployment. They'll always remember you for what you have done for them. And don't keep it to yourself. Sometimes you need to showcase also. So send it into the report that this is what we have saved for you. It is not about bragging. It is about helping them to understand. It is about making it visible to them that this is what you have done. So this was the reason we did not enable Sentinel from day one. We first built our lab environment. We first built our log data ingestion. We tested it, and then we enabled the workspace into Sentinel. I believe this answers your question, Yogesh, from the pricing perspective, that why we are not onboarding it to Sentinel, and what difference it will make, when I have these workspaces onboarded, or why can't I have multiple Sentinels, or how the billing happens. So billing will happen based on the day that you onboard the workspace in Sentinel. That's where the billing will happen. So that is why when I onboard the workspace in Sentinel today, my billing will start from today, and it will be on this basis, which is 337 rupees 70 paisa INR per GB per month basis. That's what my billing is. And if I'm not onboarding the workspace in Sentinel, then my billing is very less, which is half of it. So that is why we do this process. Now that we have 3 workspaces added, if I go to Sentinel once again, and I had created a third workspace also, which is workspace 3. If I click on create, Sentinel will already know that how many workspaces have been added and what are the remaining workspaces that this user, whosoever is performing action on this portal, this user has access to. So when I hit create, I will only see the third workspace now. You can see only third is visible because that's the only workspace which is not added to Sentinel. So this is how we add workspace, and this is the reason we add workspaces after we are 100% done with the previous phase of ingesting log sources and then testing whether logs are getting ingested or not. Then comes the Sentinel part. So now that we have 3 workspaces added into Sentinel, my question is, how will I manage these workspaces? So I'll come to the same question now, that what next? will I be adding solutions from Content Hub installing data connectors, creating analytics rule. This is exactly what we did in the training. Writing playbooks, or logic app, etc. all over again. Is this what I'm expected to do? Will I be doing the entire process for this second workspace now? And then what if in future I add another workspace? Will I be doing this activity again and again? And the first time when I did it for the first workspace, it took me 6 months. So do I need a 6 months time frame before I add a workspace? So the answer to all of these questions is no, big no. It's big no. You will not be doing all of this. Sentinel has the capability to manage multiple workspaces. Sentinel provides you the capability, which basically means you don't need to do all of this again. Some of it you will need to do, definitely. And that is why we always recommend to have a centralized workspace, but you don't need to do all of it, 100%. It is same way that you pay 180 rupees for a workspace when it is only a workspace. You pay 337 rupees when it is added to Sentinel, which is not the double, but almost 80% of the task. So 80% of the task is already done by Sentinel. When you add multiple workspaces, you don't need to start from scratch. 80% Sentinel will take care of it. 20% you need to do. Now, what is that 20% that you will do? So that 20% that you need to do is this. So you'll go to your core workspace. The first workspace you have where you have written all the analytics query and everything. You'll go to that workspace first. And in that workspace, for that workspace, you will directly go to the analytics rule and you will rewrite your analytics rule, or you will modify your analytics rule. Now, I said 20% you need to do. This is 20% that I'm talking about. And why I'm talking about this 20%? Because maybe you did not design it well. Because if this was Sentinel deployment from, and if you had identified these 3 workspaces in the very beginning, you had done it in the beginning itself. But since you have not done it, this is what you need to do. So what you need to do, you need to edit your analytics query to fetch data from the remaining 2 workspaces. Now remember, the remaining 2 workspaces already have log data ingested into it, and those workspaces also have data which is coming from various log sources. So first thing that you need to remember is that the other workspaces, this another workspace, if it is from the same customer, then there are 2 probabilities here. Same customer, same tenant, same customer across tenant, right? Those are the 2 possibilities. So the other workspace, another workspace from the same customer and same tenant. Same tenant means same Active Directory. Or another workspace from the same customer across tenant. The customer has multiple tenants. These are the 2 scenarios for my another workspace. I focus on this scenario first, and then we'll talk about across tenant part. So the workspace is from the same customer, same tenant, which means the user has access to the workspace. You don't need to configure separate access for the workspace. So workspace is from the same customer, same tenant. Now, ideally, when you were deploying Sentinel, when you were implementing Sentinel, and when I showed you the project plan the other day, you have seen that
the design discussions with respect to workspaces was already done in the previous phases. And accordingly, we had identified 6 workspaces, 2 workspaces for each region, 1 production, 1 non-production. And then we created those 6 workspaces. We ingested data based on how we wanted to ingest data. Then we added them all into the same Sentinel, right? And then we started the analytics part. So when we wrote the first analytics query, we wrote it considering all the 6 workspaces. And this is how we wrote this is how you write the analytics query. So either you add them later on or you add them at the same time. This will make the difference. So when you write the analytics query, you will need to add all of those workspaces in the query, and this is how you add. This is what will make the difference. Look at the query carefully. To save time, I have actually built this demo last night, and I cannot build it 3 days ago because there is a cost for it. So I only did it last time to save time and to be able to cover more in today's session. So what you need to do when you have multiple workspaces, when you want to write a single query for all the workspaces, this is what you need to do. You will use a union operator here, union, and then you will type workspace, name of the workspace, dot the table that you want to fetch data from. So if I want to get Azure activity logs, then I will type dot Azure activity. If I want to get sign-in logs, I'll type dot sign-in logs. If I want to get performance log, I'll type dot perf. If I want to get any other logs, I will type that. If I want to get heartbeat, I'll type heartbeat here, dot heartbeat, dot heartbeat, dot heartbeat. This is what I'll type. So this is the format that you will need to use. If you have multiple workspaces, use a union operator and you will be using this workspace. This is how you will be doing it. And after that, after you type the workspace ID dot the table that you want to query, then remaining of the query will remain the same. Remaining query will remain the same whether you write it for 1 workspace or 20 workspaces. This is the additional effort you are expected to do when you add a workspace while you already have Sentinel deployed, configured, and in production. For each workspace that you add, you will need to add that workspace into your query, and you will need to do it for all the queries. This is the 20% of the task that you need to do. So this is why planning is very important, design is very important, architecture is very important. So if you had taken into consideration all these use cases on day 1, and if you had added those 6 workspaces on day 1, then the first day when you wrote the query, you would have written the query in this manner. But since you did not take that decision, or it was not identified, or this is something recurring that your customer has come up with, that please add these additional workspaces because I've acquired another company and I want you to manage Sentinel operations for that company also in the same Sentinel, then this is what you will do. So you will just use this union operator. With union operator, you can query multiple workspaces. So if I just select this query and if I click on view query results over here, I'll just select this portion of the query. This is my portion of the query, and I'll hit run. Then it will show me Azure activity logs for all the workspaces. It is querying the logs. You can see it is showing me the logs from all the workspaces now. And if I select the entire script and run it, then I will only get the information from the log analytics workspace, the Sentinel log workspace, because in the remaining 2 workspaces, there is absolutely nothing configured. I've not configured any log sources in the remaining 2 workspaces. But this is now you're getting the data from the log analytics workspace. Am I making sense, guys?
Yes, Raghuveer. Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is how. So now you have understood that what we need to do for analytics room, which basically means I'm not expecting you to deploy and install any solution from Content Hub all over again. You don't need to do that. When you have multiple workspaces, either create the analytics query, analytics rule on day one, keeping all the workspaces in the query, or as and when you add additional workspace, come back to your query and add that additional workspace. Just add one line and add the additional workspace here. Just copy it and add the additional workspace here. That's what you need to do. Okay, so this is what you need to do. Now coming back to this query, the result of this query, actually, you look at the workspace. These are not the workspaces that we have just added to Sentinel, test workspaces. I was just showing you that this is how we do it. But this is actually your cross-tenant configuration that you see. Those two workspaces that you are seeing here, customer 1 and customer 2, they are customers' workspaces. And the query is actually bringing the result from those workspaces. And you can see the result. This result, I'm saying the result that you see, this is from customer's workspace. This is not my workspace actually. So that part I will come. So this is what we see. I'm just showing you that how do we run queries. So we are done with the query part. Then comes the logic app part. Now logic app is common. Now for the logic app, what you need to do, once again, let's go to this query. So we are done with the query part, that this is how we query multiple workspaces. Okay. Once the query part is done, then comes the incident investigation. I'll come to that part. But after incident investigation, what will happen? Automation. That's the another thing that you need to bother about. So for automation, what you need to do, now I'll go to the automation directly. Now, when it comes to the incidents from these workspaces, the incident will always have the workspace ID integrated into it. It will always have workspace ID, so you will know that this incident is from this workspace, this incident is from this workspace. Okay. Now, when it comes to automated response, let's say we have a logic app here. Now, understand the logic app part. What logic app needs? Logic app needs authentication and authorization. Exactly what we were doing yesterday. So if let's say there are 3 workspaces and I have got an incident from all the 3 workspaces, and then the incident is related to a virtual machine which has high CPU consumption. In all the 3 workspaces, there are few virtual machines which have high CPU consumption. And I have a logic app, a playbook, an automation rule that will restart the virtual machines. If the analytics rule brings up the alerts, those alerts will be converted into incident. And for each entity in the incident, entity means that virtual machine. For each entity, the logic app will be triggered. And logic app has a logic to reboot the virtual machine, restart the virtual machine. So what logic app will do? It will reboot the virtual machine. Now the question is how a logic app can reboot the virtual machine. It can reboot the virtual machine because it has workflow in the backend, it has programming in the backend. All it needs is the admin access on the virtual machine, administrative access to reboot it. So in a multi-workspace environment, in a large environment, you will have a couple of things centralized. You will have a common admin account created on all the virtual machines for Microsoft Sentinel logic app that logic app will authenticate with. So logic app will quickly use that account and reboot all the virtual machines which are part of the incident. That's how logic app will do. So which means in the logic app, you don't need to do any additional coding. All you need to do is choose an account that has access, administrative access, to take care of the entities involved in the incident. That is how logic app concept comes. No changes in the logic app, no changes in the configuration, no changes on the portal, nothing. Only the account that you need to choose must have access, appropriate access to perform that automation that you have configured in the logic app you need to do. So we are done with the logic app part. Now let's come back. So I was saying that do I need to do all this? No. So I will not be adding solution from Content Hub. I will be using the existing solution. I will not be installing data connector once again. I will not be creating analytics rule. I would rather modify the rule to accommodate or to query additional workspace that I've just added. That's the only change that I'm doing here. I will modify the query to accommodate the additional work. This is one change that I'm doing when I have multiple. Okay, next. So we are done with the playbooks.
Raghu, I have a question here.
Give me a moment.
So
Let
you
me-
said that we will not be adding data connectors. Okay. So suppose I have one workspace and in future we hired one more company. Okay. So that is for that we created a new workspace. So now we have one workspace and the second one is for the new company. So for the workspace two, okay, we are going to have different devices, firewalls, then some load balancer. So for that, if we onboard those firewalls, so do we have to onboard it in first workspace, first Sentinel,
Okay,
or the second one? That is,
okay. Let's park your question. When we come to this part, I'll answer this question because you're asking this question. You're saying another customer. So we have not reached to another customer, Yogesh. We are still working with the same customer, same tenant. If you say this question in this manner, that same customer, same tenant, that the same customer has acquired a new solution, a new firewall, and now the customer wants to ingest logs from the firewall, the customer has the capability to pick and choose any of the workspace that is added to the Sentinel, any of the three workspaces. Customer can pick up and choose any of the three workspaces to ingest logs from that firewall, and your query will hardly make any difference because your query already, I'm saying, since it is a new solution, definitely you will write a new query. So when you write a new query, and if you know that the logs are only coming into this workspace from the firewall, then definitely you will only include the workspace. So that is the 20% part that I'm talking about, that whenever you need to write a query which is common for all the workspaces, then you will write a separate query. Whenever you need to write a query which is only for one workspace, you will write a separate query. Or to make your life easier, write a common query. Make use of union operator for all the queries that you write. What will happen? You will only pay a penny extra for Sentinel. Why? Because what Sentinel will do, when Sentinel will use that query, it will go to all the three workspaces to analyze the logs, to look for the table. So let's say you are querying you have a firewall that you have added, a new firewall that you have onboarded. And instead of creating a new analytics rule, for the specific workspace where the firewall is added, you have created a common rule and you have put a union operator and you have added all the workspaces. Now what Sentinel will do? Now the log analytics workspace which contains the firewall logs, which is getting the firewall logs, has a table in it. So what log analytics workspace what Sentinel will do, since you have written a common query, Sentinel will go to all the three workspaces, look for that table and fetch the data. However, it will only get data from one workspace, but Sentinel will charge you for the analysis because Sentinel charges you based on the analysis. So Sentinel will charge you a small cent for that additional effort that it has to do to query other two workspaces where it could not get the data. This is where cost optimization comes into the picture. So you will write analytics rule in two manner. If there is a log source which is only unique to a workspace, you will write an analytics query, KQL query for that workspace only. But if there is a log source which is common to all the three workspace, then you will write an analytics query by putting a union operator. And the example is, if it is about, let's say, understand the logs, sign-in logs. Now sign-in logs comes from Azure AD, and Azure AD is common for all the workspaces inside a tenant. So definitely you will ingest sign-in logs to single workspace in the tenant. You will not ingest sign-in logs to all the workspaces. What is the point of doing it? And when you are writing a query for sign-in logs related to sign-in logs, in that query you will only refer that workspace, not all the workspaces. However, if it is about activity log, activity logs are part of subscription. They come from a subscription, and each subscription has its own activity log, right? So if you have workspaces designated for each subscription, then you will be ingesting activity log from subscription A to workspace A, subscription B to workspace B. In that case, when you write query, in your query, you will be using union operator. So in your query, you will be using union operator and reference all workspaces here. All the workspaces. So you will reference all the workspaces here in your query because this activity log is part of all the workspaces. I mean, say all the workspaces contains activity log. Another example, virtual machine. Now, when we are creating multiple virtual machines, there is a probability that we are keeping virtual machines logs in all the workspaces. Why we are creating multiple workspaces? Because there's a need, and the need could be because some business unit wants to separate their logs. They want to keep a separate billing. So we create a separate workspace for them to keep all their log data, which includes virtual machine also. So if it is virtual machine, and if it is part of all the subscription, all the workspaces, and the virtual machines logs are getting ingested in all the workspaces, then you will write a common query in the analytics rule. So this is how you will need to optimize your analytics rule. To optimize the cost of Sentinel, to save the effort of Sentinel. If I unnecessarily keep on using union operator and reference all the workspaces and all the analytics query from day one, I will unnecessarily make my Sentinel sweat more and find and look into all the workspaces for which it will charge me. And it will also take time for the results to come. The query will returns in 20 seconds because it had to go to 20 workspaces to get the data, while the data was only available in one workspace, which could have been done in 2 seconds. So this is where the optimization comes into the picture. This is where the architecture comes into the picture. These are the architectural concepts that how am I designing my Sentinel architecture? And it is not about workspaces only. It is about query. It is about analytics rule. It is about workbook. It is about logic app. It is about every minute component of Sentinel. Am I making sense now? That why are we using multiple workspaces? And if we are using, then how are we writing analytics rule? And whether we are creating 2 analytics rule or 1 analytics rule, and on what, in what use cases we are creating this. Any additional question, Yogesh or Mejun or any participant on this use case, that how we are writing analytics query when we have multiple workspaces? So we are not writing separate analytics query for all the workspaces. That will take a lot of time. Whenever there is a common data that we need to fetch, we will write all the workspaces in the query. Wherever there is a data which is individual to a workspace, we'll write a normal query. So if it is Azure AD logs, I will only, and I'm only ingesting Azure AD logs in one single workspace. When I write any query for Azure AD logs, I will only reference that workspace because I know the other 2 workspaces absolutely have no data related to Azure AD logs, sign logs. So this is how I am actually doing it. Okay, so we are done with the analytics part, which is my first step. So as I said, we are not installing the data connectors all over again. It will be the same. We are not creating analytics query. We are just modifying the rules to accommodate or to query additional workspaces, depending on whether those additional workspaces have appropriate data sources or not, logs or not. And for playbooks, what we are doing in addition, for playbooks, we are just connecting the account which has appropriate access. That's it. If you are doing automation for 20 workspaces, then you will need to use an account that has administrative access to perform the action related to those 20 workspaces. That's the only thing that you need to change in the query in your logic app. Rest is the same. So we are done with collect and automate. So we are done, sorry, we are done with collect is common. We are done with detect and automate. Then comes the respond part. That how do I respond to incidents? So let me show you the respond part also. Now, when it comes to the respond part, if I'm an incident responder, if I belong to, I'm saying, depending on who I am, whether I'm a level 1 person, level 2 person, level 3 person, and what is my responsibility, whether I'm being given responsibility to manage incidents for one workspace or all the workspaces, I'll select the workspace. So if I need to manage incidents for two workspaces, first two workspaces, I select both the workspaces like this. And then you see an option over here that says view incident. I will click on view incidents and it will directly take me to the incident console wherein I will see the incident for all the workspaces that I have selected. Now here you will see incidents for both the workspaces. However, those two workspaces do not have any data ingested. So that is why you don't see an incident. But in the incident itself, you will have workspace mentioned. So you will not get mixed up that which incident which incident belongs to which workspace. No, incident will always have workspace name. So you will always know, okay, this incident belongs to this workspace. So now you see all the incidents. So that is how you will. Now what happens after this, you already know. How do we investigate incident? I have told you in detail when I covered the investigate part, investigate phase. So after you see all the incident, rest of the phase remains the same. Logic app is same. Analytics query is same. This is how we manage incidents. Once again, you need to select the workspaces for which you want to see the incidents. If you are managing all the workspaces and responsible to investigate, remediate incidents for all the workspaces, select them all and click on view incidents. That's how you will be able to see the incidents. Now, let's say you don't do it like this. If you don't do it like this, and if you only go to a specific workspace, then you will only see the incidents of that workspace. If I go to Sentinel Law, I will only see the incidents of Sentinel Law workspace here. If I go to this workspace, I will only see the incidents of this workspace here. If I go to this workspace, I'll see the incidents of this workspace. So if I'm focusing on a specific workspace as my role and responsibility, I'll go to that workspace. If I am responsible to manage incidents of all the workspace, I'll select them all and click on view incidents. That is how I'll see the incidents of all the workspaces. So this goes the incident management. So we are done with collect, detect, investigate, and remediate when there are multiple workspaces that you need to manage with Sentinel. I'll take pause here and I'm open to questions. And I've tried to explain it in the simplest manner possible. So definitely it would have made sense to my operations team member also, who have not yet looked into this aspect of Sentinel in the past. But this is how we do it. This is how we manage a single workspace versus multiple workspaces belonging to the same customer. If you don't have any other question, we'll take a break. I've been talking at a stretch for the last hour and a half, so I need a break. After this break, we will talk about across tenant. That what will be my strategy or what will change when these workspaces belongs to multiple customers or multiple tenants, then how the strategy will change. That is what we are going to discuss after the break. Okay, so we are done with this use case. Let's move on to the next use case, which is, so now that we have understood that if the same customer has multiple workspaces, first of all, I would say my best practice is to have centralized workspace because centralized workspace makes it easy, makes it easy deployment, quick process, life is smooth, things are simple. That's what centralized workspace is.
However, centralized workspace is not possible all the time. There are probabilities wherein you may end up deploying multiple workspaces and then ingesting data in those workspaces and connecting all of those workspaces to Sentinel. In that case, how do you manage Sentinel operations is what we have seen. Now, the use case that we have seen was multiple workspaces from the same customer, same tenant. Now, my another use case is another workspace from the same customer across tenant and another workspace from a different customer. So these are the two use cases that I need to focus on. That how do I manage Sentinel operations in this case when the same customer has another Azure AD tenant, another company that they acquired, or another Azure AD tenant, and they also have workspaces in those tenant, and those workspaces have log ingested into it. They're configured for log ingestion, and data sources are sending logs to those workspaces. The other use case is that another workspace from a different customer. So now I am acting as an MSSP, managed security service provider, and I am managing security operations for multiple customers. So how will I design my Sentinel architecture? So designing a Sentinel architecture for an MSSP. That's the other thing that you need to understand. So if DXC is an MSSP, wherein DXC has multiple customers for whom DXC is managing security operations, then how do DXC needs to design its architecture for the security solution? And security solution here in question is Microsoft Sentinel. Now there will be, I'm saying any project or any initiative would have three pillars, three technology pillars: people, process, and technology. So people, process, and technology. This is the three pillars of any initiative. So when it comes to people, DXC employees. Roles, responsibility is what DXC needs to identify and accordingly put it in place. Then comes process. Process basically means that how DXC is going to support security monitoring operations for the customer. Now, this how basically involves standard operating procedure, SLAs, what procedure they will follow, what documents they will follow, what is the agreement. In SLA, they would have mentioned the initial response time, the lead time to resolve an incident, all that, and then agreement, overall agreement that will contain the penalty clause, that will contain the scope of support, that what will be in scope, what will be out of scope, all of that. So that goes into the process, that what process do they follow. Process also involves whether the support is 24/7, whether it is 16/5, whether it is 8/5, that all goes into the process. So DXC will manage the process also. Then comes the technology piece. Technology basically means the solution using which you will manage the security operation. And that solution here is Microsoft Sentinel. So that's what we need to manage. So I leave people and process part to DXC. And it differs from organization to organization how they manage their people and process part. So how DXC is going to manage it, who will be part of the team, at what level, what will be the designation of those people, how are they working, what is the SLA. I'll leave that. And I have full confidence in the capability of the management, DXC management, to streamline it, to make it as effective as possible. Let's focus on the technology part, that how do we manage the technology in this case. So I'll talk about two use cases together because the process will remain the same.
And those two use cases are this, that we have additional workspaces from the same customer, but they are part of other tenants, or we have additional workspaces from different customers. And now we are acting as a managed security service provider. How do I manage the operations? How do I manage? So what will be my Sentinel architecture? Let's focus on the architecture because it will remain common. So my Sentinel architecture, and then yesterday I also talked about two areas, which is most of the MSSPs, they are also CSP. Okay, over here, CSP. So MSSPs are also CSP, which means they are also cloud services provider. And what does CSP means? That you will purchase a CSP subscription from Microsoft, which is like a container subscription. Inside that subscription, inside the CSP tenant, you will create multiple subscriptions and designate it to your customers. So your customers will basically use those subscriptions to provision services and resources. At the end of the month, you will bill those customers based on the consumption. And at the end of the month, Microsoft will bill you based on the consumption. So what is the benefit to a CSP? The benefit is that this is like renting a house. This is like you take, let's say there's a builder, who has built a multi-story apartment. There are 100 apartments in that. Now you basically sign a deal with the builder tell me how much rent you expect from all of these 100 apartments. And builder says, I'm expecting $100,000 a month. So you say that, okay, I'll give you $100,000 a month and I'll take it on rent. And you pay them $100,000 a month. Now you will rent out those 100 apartments to 100 families. And now you are charging 120. Some markup, you will add some markup and you will rent it out to the people. Now those people are your responsibility because they are your customer. So they are paying you at the end of the month. You are collecting all the rent. You are taking your profit from it, and then you are paying it back to Microsoft. So you become a mediator here. So CSP is a mediator that also makes money in this process. And why do people come to CSP? Because they have confidence in their capabilities, because they need support. So when somebody comes to you and say that we need security operations, support from you, you can say that why don't you use our CSP subscription? Why don't you build your resources in my subscription? I will manage both your resources as well as your security monitoring. So that way you are making money as a CSP. So most of the MSSPs are also CSPs. Now, if you are not a CSP, then there is another way of making money for you, which is DPOR, which is Digital Partner of Record. What is this Digital Partner of Record? Microsoft, Microsoft gives you a lot of money. There is a lot of money with Microsoft, and so that's what I have understood so far while working as a Microsoft employee for 3 years, almost 4 years, and then while working on Microsoft technologies for the last 20 years. Microsoft has a lot of money. How does Microsoft encourages service provider or encourages business to bring more and more customers to their cloud? So what Microsoft does, Microsoft says that if you have a customer who is not hosting their services in your CSP, but customer is using their own account, they are using their own pay-as-you-go account, they are using their own enterprise agreement, and they are also using Azure services that you are supporting. So you have an ID. There's an ID that has been assigned to you, enterprise ID. So what you will do, you will ask your customer to go to their EA portal and add you as a service provider. So DXC will ask its customer that why don't you add us as your service provider? And DXC will provide an ID. Customer will log into its respective enterprise tenant, EA tenant or account, Azure account, and there customer will put that ID under service provider. So when DXC's ID is there as a service provider in the customer's tenant, whatever is the monthly billing of the customer, some percentage of it will go to DXC. So if customer is paying $100,000 a month to Microsoft, and if DXC's ID is there in the customer's tenant as DPOR, digital partner of record, then DXC will get some percentage of it, some percentage of revenue without making any effort. However, why would a customer put your ID in their tenant? They would only put when you are there, when they are your customer. And customer would not mind doing it. I still remember back in 2014, when this initiative was launched by Microsoft, when this CSP concept was introduced by Microsoft, most of the small-time companies, they were making $100,000. I'm saying $500,000 worth of profit by using DPOR. So what they did, they asked all their customers to put their ID in their tenant. And since their IDs was reflecting as per the initiative of DPOR, if a customer has DPOR configured, then whosoever is that partner, whosoever is the service provider, will directly get the benefit credited to their account. So this used to be a huge, this used to be a great, great piece of encouragement for the service providers. And after that, when something becomes public, everybody else is aware of it, then it loses its value. So now today customers understand. So what customers are doing, they are becoming their own service provider to get billing benefits from Microsoft. So they're creating two accounts. One account, they are acting as a service provider, and then they use the service provider's ID in their actual account where they're consuming the services from. So they are making themselves as their service provider, and they're getting some discounts from Microsoft, which is not good, which is unethical. If Microsoft comes to know about it, Microsoft cancels the account, terminates the account. But this is what people are also doing. This is how they are making money. Okay. So this is what you also need to take into consideration in those use cases, that who you are. Are you only an MSSP or you are CSP also? So in this case, let's understand the use case that I'm taking here. These are the two use cases. So in this case, the use case of MSSP, the MSSP is also a CSP. Now let's talk about the use cases. Okay. So in both the use cases, when the workspaces are across tenant, and if I go to my Sentinel deployment, you can see I cannot see anything across tenant. Why I cannot see anything? Because if I want to see anything across tenant, I will need to switch directory, and I will have to be granted access to that tenant. You can see there is no tenant here. And that's exactly what I have shown you from my individual ID, that my ID has got access to multiple clients tenant. And that is why I can switch directory and I can get into that tenant. So that's the first thing that you need to understand. Now, let's take the first use case wherein it is the same customer but across tenant. So if it is across tenant, what will be the customer do? What this customer will do? So let's say it is the same customer, and when I say it is the same customer, which means there is no MSSP concept here. It is DXC. DXC has multiple tenants. So DXC has two Azure Active Directory tenants. Tenant A and tenant B. These are the two tenants. And in tenant A, DXC has one subscription, which is Azure Pass sponsorship, the one that we have. And in tenant B, DXC has two subscriptions, subscription A and subscription B.
And inside subscription A, in second tenant, there's a workspace A. And inside subscription B, there's a workspace B and C. So this is my use case now. Let's do the Sentinel deployment for this use case. So for this use case, when we are doing the Sentinel deployment, what we need to keep in mind is the starting point. So my starting point is that I will need to pick up one of the tenant as my main tenant where I will be deploying the Sentinel. So let's say I'll pick up tenant A as my main tenant where Sentinel will be deployed. So I pick up tenant A. So tenant A is my main tenant hosting Sentinel services. So tenant A will host the Sentinel service, not services, Sentinel service. And in tenant A, whatever workspaces I have, whether 1, 2, 3, whatever workspaces I have, which is Sentinel law test workspace 1, test workspace. I'm trying to relate it to the lab that we have, the environment that we have built. Test workspace 2 and test workspace 3. These are the workspaces in the tenant A, which is the main tenant, which is here. These are the workspaces 1, 2, and 3, test workspace 1, 2, and 3, and Sentinel law. So I have already taken care of this part. So what I have done, I have deployed Sentinel in my main tenant. Tenant A has a subscription, Azure Pass sponsorship. In that subscription, I have deployed Sentinel service, and I have configured log sources in all the 3, 4 workspaces here, 1, 2, and 3. And I have also, added all of these workspaces into my Sentinel service, and I have configured these workspaces to get log ingested from the appropriate data sources. This part is done. This part is already done that you see here in this deployment in this lab. And this was my first use case, the first use case that I was discussing prior to break. Now I'll go to the next part of it. So this part is done. To Active Directory tenant, this part is covered, that we have tenant A and all of this is covered. My Sentinel operations is running fine. Now DXC acquires another company and DXC got tenant B. Now what I will need to do now, tenant B has its own workspaces, workspace A, B, and C. And in these workspaces, there are data sources sending data to it. So I also need to manage these workspaces using Sentinel. I also need to investigate logs coming into these workspaces and identify if there are threats. So I need to do, threat hunting here also. For that, I will need to do what? For that, I will need to onboard these workspaces, these 3 workspaces, A, B, and C. So onboard workspace A, workspace B and C into main tenant Sentinel. This is what I need to do. I will need to onboard them into my main tenant Sentinel, which is this tenant A, main tenant Sentinel. How will I do this? Because if you go by design, 2 tenants don't talk to each other. They have no visibility. So you cannot directly go to the other tenant. That's not possible. Now, there are 2 things here. First is identities, and second is solution. My solution is Microsoft Sentinel. Identity is employees. If I'm taking the same example that both the tenants belong to the same customer, then employees are part of the same company. It is the same company.
However, since these tenants are separate, you will need to have this employee's account created in both the tenant. Then only employees will have access to it. Solution is Microsoft Sentinel that you have in the main tenant, and you will want this solution to be leveraged. You don't want to build another Sentinel solution in the other tenant and manage it separately. Then it will be a huge, humongous effort. It will take a lot of time because you will need to do the entire phases of Sentinel, which is collect, detect, investigate, automate, remediate, all of that. So what I will do, how do I gain access? My question, the challenge that I have is here that this is my main tenant. When I click on create here, I do not see the workspaces of the other tenant. That's the only challenge that I have. If I have, I'm saying if by some means I can get access to the other tenant, I'm saying if by some means I can have workspace A, B, and C reflecting here, I will quickly be able to add them to my Sentinel service. And then with the help of queries, I will be able to manage them, right? But those workspaces are not visible here. That is the challenge because it only shows me the subscription, which is the subscription that I am. So that is the challenge. So what I need basically, I need a solution. So I need a solution that gives me visibility across tenant. And when I say across tenant, I'm basically looking for access to any workspace of the other tenants. That is what I'm looking at this moment. This is my ultimate objective, that I need access to the log analytics workspace of the other tenant. Somehow the log analytics workspace of the other tenant starts to show here. The moment I will be able to see it here, I'll quickly add it to my workspace. I'll quickly add it to Sentinel service and I will be able to manage the operations. So I need that visibility. I need a solution. Now solution here is Lighthouse. This is the name of the solution, or we can call it Azure Lighthouse. Azure Lighthouse is the solution. Azure Lighthouse is a cross-tenant management solution provided by Azure that gives you visibility across tenants, that lets you manage resources across tenant. That's the solution. So identity will remain the same. Solution will remain the same, Microsoft Sentinel, and the across tenant visibility will be provided by Azure Lighthouse. So you will need to configure the Azure Lighthouse. Now, how Lighthouse works, how do we configure it? So you need to understand some building blocks of Lighthouse. So my building blocks of Lighthouse is, you need to understand some terminologies. First terminology is managing tenant. Second terminology is managed tenant. Managing tenant is also known as service provider. And managed tenant is known as customer. These are the terminologies that you need to understand for Lighthouse. So managing tenant is known as service provider and managed tenant is known as customer. And in this use case, these two use cases, you will need to use Lighthouse in both the use cases because you want visibility across tenant. So whether it is the same customer who needs visibility across tenant or whether it's an MSSP who needs visibility of the tenant and resources of their customer, the concept will remain the same. You need Lighthouse. And when you deploy Lighthouse, you will have a managing tenant, which is your primary tenant, main tenant, and you will have managed tenant, which is the other tenants. If your managing and managed tenant are part of two different organizations, then managing tenant is your service provider and managed tenant is customers. If it is part of the same organization, then also the same terminology. So how do I configure Lighthouse? It's very simple. In order to configure Lighthouse, the managed tenant will run a PowerShell script I'm saying you can run a PowerShell script or an ARM template to grant access to managing tenant. This is what we need to do. So you will run a script in the managed tenant that will grant access of your tenant to the managing tenant. And what will be contained in that script? That script will contain the tenant ID. Since you are running the script in the managing tenant, I'm sorry, since you're running the script in the managed tenant, I'm saying customer is running the script. So managed tenant is customer basically. Customer is running the script. So customer needs the tenant ID of the managing tenant or service provider. Customer needs object ID of the identities. Identities here are employees needing access to customer tenant and the level of access, which is RBAC, level of access for identities. This is the three piece of information that you need. So tenant ID of the managing tenant service provider, or if it is the same customer, then tenant ID of the other main tenant, object ID of the identities that needs access, and the level of access that they need. This is the three piece of information that you need to ask from your service provider or from whosoever who manages the managing tenant, the main tenant. Once you get this information, you will run the script in the managed tenant. The customer will run the script in its tenant, and automatically the managing tenant, the identities, and the level of access, whatever you grant, they will get access to it. So that's how we configure the Lighthouse. Now let's see real quick the Lighthouse architecture. I'll quickly show you. All right. Here's a quick architecture that I built for one of the big four when I was providing, when I used to run Cloud Center of Excellence there. Okay. So this is the architecture of Lighthouse. Let's quickly understand it. To your right, the image that you see is your managing tenant. This is the service provider's tenant or the root tenant or the primary tenant. This is the managing tenant. Okay. So this is the managing tenant. It says I will not take the name on the recorded session. So this is the managed tenant, managing tenant. Managing tenant is the service provider. Service provider has a SOC team, L1, L2, and L3, and service provider has in its managing managing tenant. They have Sentinel deployed. They have all the analytics rule configured. They have security playbooks or logic app automation rule configured. Everything in there. Managing tenant, everything is configured. Now, what the managing tenant does, now managing tenant, how it works. So managing tenant has an Azure Active Directory. That Active Directory is integrated with the subscription where the Sentinel deployments are. Here's the client tenant. Let's understand how client tenant works. So this is the client tenant or the other tenant of the same customer or the actual customer for the MSSP. In the client tenant, you also have a Microsoft Azure subscription, an Azure Active Directory, You also have Azure resources like virtual machines. You have activity logs. You have log analytics workspace here in the client tenant, in the customer tenant. So now log analytics workspace is getting logs from Azure AD sign-in logs. It is also getting logs from activity logs. It is also getting logs from virtual machines. It is also getting logs ingested from various Azure resources. So understand these yellow dotted lines, they are showing the log ingestion part. That in the client tenant, they have log analytics workspaces, and those workspaces are ingesting logs into the those resources in the client tenant are ingesting logs into the workspaces. And client also has Sentinel services. Client also has Logic app. That's the secondary part. So this is how client tenant is. Now these two are separate tenant. There is no connectivity in between. You can see this is separate. Managing tenant is separate. Client tenant is separate. How do we connect? So in order to connect, I will deploy Lighthouse service in the customer's tenant, in the managed tenant. By running that script, I will deploy a Lighthouse service. Once the Lighthouse service is deployed, it will directly get via Lighthouse the service provider's managing tenant, the service provider's Active Directory, and the customer's Active Directory will be connected via Lighthouse. Now both the tenants have visibility, clear line of sight via Lighthouse. And because of this clear line of sight, now these two tenants, client log analytics tenant, these two tenants, they are now visible in service provider's tenant. Once again, see it. Right now in the service provider's tenant, for this client, there is no workspace. But as soon as Lighthouse service is deployed, now these two tenants that you see here, these two tenants, client log analytics tenant, these two workspaces that you see here, now because of Lighthouse service, they will start to show here. Now they are here. It is not they are moved here. No, they will be visible here. So when they will be visible here, what the service provider will do, service provider will then directly navigate to the same screen to its managing tenant. Service provider will go to Microsoft Sentinel screen, and here service provider will hit create, and service provider will be able to see all the log analytics workspaces of the customer because of Lighthouse service providing access. So that's the concept of Lighthouse, that using Lighthouse, I can manage operations across tenants. Now these two tenants can be of the same customer. There is no service provider in this picture. It is the same customer which has two tenants. So one is main tenant, the other is member tenant. You can say master slave tenant. And all the other tenants or slave tenants will be sending data to the master tenant, where the data will be processed by Sentinel service. This is the concept of Lighthouse. Azure Lighthouse provides capability for cross-tenancy management of Azure services for managed security service providers. Azure Lighthouse is integrated with Azure Sentinel, allowing MSSPs to easily manage Azure Sentinel workspaces from across managing multiple tenants. And enabling Azure Lighthouse for Sentinel requires configuration on both the managing tenant and client tenant. So you need configuration on both the tenant. When I say configuration, it basically means information. So you can configure it in both the tenant. Give me a moment. Okay. So this is the beauty of Azure Lighthouse, that it will allow you to manage. It will allow you to manage resources or services across the tenant. Now, Azure Lighthouse is not only for Microsoft Sentinel. Azure Lighthouse is a cross-tenant management service. You can deploy Azure Lighthouse in any use case. If you have multiple tenants and you want to manage all the tenants from one console, you can deploy Azure Lighthouse and it will allow you to manage. Sentinel is just one application of it, one use case that it serves. It has hundreds of use cases. So it's a great service that we use for cross-tenant management. Now, how do we deploy the service? As I said, you need a script. I will share all the documentation with you, references with you, but I will not deploy it here because once you run the script, it takes 15 to 20 minutes to get deployed. And that is why I had it deployed already. So if you remember, here it says, this is what you need to deploy it. So you need tenant ID of the managing tenant, object ID of the identities, and level of access. So what I have done, I have already deployed the Lighthouse services, and I have identified a couple of identities, couple of employees who will need access to the customer's tenant, and the level of access I have also identified. Okay, so where it says employees, I have one identity that I've granted access to. Now I'll show you. So this is my managing tenant. This sponsorship pass is my managing tenant. And in this managing tenant, if I go to switch directory here, you can see I don't see any other directory because I have not granted access to this user in the managing tenant. This user doesn't have access. There is another user who has access in this tenant. So that another user, I will now show you that user. So this is my Azure Active Directory. This user from managing tenant has access to customer's tenant or the other tenant. So this is my user, test user. This user has been granted access to test user. So what I will do, I actually forgot the password. Last night I actually reset it and then I myself forgot. So I'll reset the password for this user. I've reset the password. Now I'll log in using this user in this tenant. I did one mistake actually. I did not copy the password. So I will need to log in back using the main tenant information. Now in the managing tenant, in the service provider tenant, some users have access to the customer's tenant, managed tenant. So one of the user is logging into. Give me a moment here. So I'm logged in using a different user account, and this user account has been configured with access to cross tenant. In the Lighthouse script that I ran last night, In that script, I will provide the object ID of the identities. So I've selected this user account and I've granted this user account contributor access on the customer subscription. That's what I have done. So I'll go back to this user account. Now on this user account, if I click on switch directory, and if I see all subscriptions, you will see that it also shows me subscriptions in the other directory. So this is the default directory, Azure Pass Sponsorship Subscription, that this user is part of. And then I also see other two directories, which says Azure Training Subscription and Sandbox Subscription. Now this default directory, the other two directories, they are part of customers tenant. I'll show you where they are. Now this is my customer tenant. So in this tenant, you see there are subscriptions. There are two subscriptions, Azure Training Subscription and Sandbox Subscription. These are the two subscriptions here. And over here, give me a moment. It is not actually switching. Okay, I am actually here. Okay, over here. This is my customer subscription. You can see in this subscription, if I go to, this is my customer tenant. If I go here into subscriptions, I'll see two subscription here, Azure Training Subscription and Sandbox Subscription. This is my customer tenant. And in this customer tenant, how do I know whether Lighthouse is configured or not? In the tenant, I can search for service providers and I will see my service provider. So managed tenant or customer tenant will click on service providers and it will see the service provider here. This is the service provider. You can see multiple entries here because I have run multiple scripts to grant access. So you see multiple entries. So this is the customer will click on service provider and it will see the service provider here. So this is the service provider information. If you see that in the service provider, well, this is the information of the service provider. Service provider directory name is default directory and the ID of the service provider is this. This is the service provider default directory ID. I'll copy this ID and I'll put it into the notepad. Now I'll move to service provider. This is my service provider, which is this subscription. And if I go to service provider default directory, this is the directory ID. I'll copy it and I'll copy it on the notepad. You can match. It is the same ID. See? So I have both the configuration. This is my customer. Customer will click on service provider and customer see the Lighthouse subscription here, where customer will see the service provider details. Customer will also see the role assignment that in the service provider has been granted contributor access. This is the service provider access. And similarly, the service provider, this is the service provider. Service provider will click on customer and service provider will click on my customers and service provider will see all the customers that it has. So you can see in the service provider blade, you see a default directory. This is the customer tenant. Now, if I copy this directory here, this is the customer ID or customer, default directory. If I copy this default directory here, the customer ID, this is the customer directory. And if I go to the customer directory, which is this directory, because here it says service provider. If I go to customers directory and copy it, you will see it is the same. See the same number here. So this is the concept of Lighthouse, that after you deploy the Lighthouse, the customer will be able to see its service provider and the access that has been granted to the service provider. The service provider will be able to see all their customers. So since this is the service provider tenant, in this service provider tenant, imagine this is DXC tenant, you will see all your customers here. And when you click on the information, you will see all the subscriptions that you have been granted access to and all the users who have been granted access to. You can see. So this is the service provider. Service provider will click on the customer and service provider will see that service provider has access to these subscriptions from the customer directory. And this is the role that has been assigned to service provider user. So service provider has a user with the name test who has been assigned contributor access. Service provider has a user test user 1 who has been provided Microsoft Sentinel contributor access. Service provider has another user Raghu Singh who has been provided contributor access. Service provider has another user, I'm saying because there are two subscriptions, training subscriptions and Sandbox. So all these subscriptions needs to be provided access here. So this is how service provider will see. Now, in a production environment, you will only run the Lighthouse script once for your customer. And in that one script, you will provide all the details. So in that one script to your customer, you will provide all the details at once. You will tell your customer that, okay, this is my tenant ID, and this is the object ID of all the employees who will be supporting your environment. And here's the level of access that you need to grant. So customer will run the script in the tenant, which will contain all the employees' identities of the service provider and the level of access that needs to be granted. And once customer will run the script, then this is how the view will be. Then the service provider will see all its customer and customer will see its service provider. This is how Lighthouse enables cross-tenant access. Yes.
Yeah, Raghuveer, from the service provider, where we have to go?
From the service provider, where we have to go?
Yes, to check the customer.
Okay, in the service provider tenant, this is my service provider tenant. Okay, in the service provider tenant, in the search, you need to type my customers.
Okay.
And customers, all the customers.
So I clicked on my customers, but I'm not able to see customer. But we have Lighthouse configured. Any special permission required from the service provider end? Like I'm not global admin on the service provider end.
Then you will not be able to, because this is directory related information. It will only be shown. That is why I said that when that is why I said that when the customer will run the script, service provider will provide this information. So what service provider will do? Service provider will provide the identities of all the employees and the level of access that needs to be granted. So against to service provider will have a spreadsheet. Service provider will send a spreadsheet. In one column, all the employees' name will be written. In the other column, the level of access will be written. So probably you have not been granted access on the customer's Azure Active Directory tenant global reader access. That is why you're not able to see that information. So if you had reader access, then you would have been able to see.
Okay.
So the SOC team will comprise of level 1, level 2 engineers, level 3 engineers, let's say level 2 and level 3 engineers. So level 1 engineers will be provided reader access, and this will be Sentinel specific RBAC. So let's see the Sentinel specific RBAC. Okay, these are the RBAC. So this is how the access will be provided. So let's say Microsoft Sentinel contributor will be provided to level 3 engineer. This is the RBAC that your company DXC will send this information to the customer and say, here's the information that you need to enable Lighthouse to configure Lighthouse. So all the level 3 engineers will be provided Sentinel contributor access and also the automation contributor. This is the level of access for level 3 engineers. Level 2 engineers are typically the responders, incident responders, So they will be provided Microsoft Sentinel responder access. And level 1 engineer are the entry level engineer. They will be provided Microsoft Sentinel reader access. This is the level of access that will be provided on Microsoft services, Sentinel service only. Then you also have, playbook operator. The playbook operator will be provided to incident responder so that they can also run playbooks while investigating an incident. So this is how access will be provided. Now there's a high probability that you are also responsible to manage, manage resources in customer's tenant. In customer's tenant, you're also responsible. So level 3 engineers, they are not only managing Sentinel. Related to Sentinel, if they need to modify any service in customer's tenant, they also need access. So accordingly, the additional access will be provided. For example, virtual machine contributor, network contributor, depending on what level of work you need to do in customer's tenant, or let's say contributor access on the subscription itself. So this is how the RBAC will be decided. Now all of this information will go into this spreadsheet that will be sent to the customer, and customer will add this information into the script, and customer will run the script. When the script is successful, these people will get access based on what RBAC they have been provided. So probably the level of access that you have been provided in the customer's tenant does not include the capability to see it. That is why I'm not able to see it. The reason why I'm able to see it, my customers, because this test user, I would say this test has been provided. My access that I have on the customer's account is contributor. You can see here, test, I have contributor access on training subscription, and I also have contributor access on SendWorks subscription. Since I just created this for demo purpose, I have directly used the subscription specific role instead of Sentinel specific. Make sense? Does that answer your question, Yogesh?
Yes, Raghuveer. And from where we can generate the script?
That
Where
I will
we
show.
need.
Don't worry, that I show you. Okay, so this is how we configure the Lighthouse. Now that Lighthouse is configured, now let's see what my customer has. First of all, this is my customer's tenant, Raghuveer _ 2016. This is my customer's tenant. In this tenant, if I go to log analytics workspace, I have two log analytics workspace, customer 1 workspace, customer 2 workspace. I'll create one more workspace here real quick. So I'll create another workspace, customer. I want to use the same terminology, customer 2 workspace. So this is another workspace that I'm creating. So this is another workspace that customer is creating actually. So customer has now one more workspace. It all depends what level of services you are providing to the customer. Sometimes you are responsible to deploy Lighthouse from scratch for the customer. Sorry, deploy Sentinel from scratch. Sometimes customer already has Sentinel in place and you just need to monitor it. So I'm just assuming that Sentinel is in place at customer's place and you are just going to monitor it. But if you're going to deploy it from scratch, then you also need contributor access at the customer's tenant so that you can create workspaces, you can configure log ingestion, you can configure all of that. So this workspace is getting created. So customer is now creating a new workspace and customer will say to its service provider that you know what, I have a new workspace. Can you onboard it? Can you also start managing this workspace or managing the incidents for this workspace? That's what we are going to do in this demo.
So Raghuveer, this workspace cannot be renamed, no?
You
I
cannot
tried.
rename any service name in Azure. Not only workspace, any service name in Azure cannot be renamed.
Okay.
That is why naming convention is very important. So when you are designing an Azure infrastructure or Azure landing zone or Azure architecture for your customer, you will need to decide on the naming strategy on day one, that how will I be naming my resources in Azure? And it has to remain consistent throughout the journey. Otherwise, you will get confused yourself. So this workspace is deployed. Now you can see if customer has three workspaces, customer 1, 2, and 3 three workspaces. There are three workspaces in the customer subscription, right? Customer has two subscriptions, training subscription and sandbox subscription. I'll create one more workspace in sandbox subscription. So this workspace is getting created. Okay, this one got created also. I'll navigate to the workspaces. Now I've got 4 workspaces in the customer subscription. In the customer's tenant, customer has 2 subscriptions in the tenant, sandbox subscription and Azure training subscription, and it has got 4 workspaces in total, 1, 2, 3, and 4. There are 4 workspaces. Now I'll navigate to my service provider's tenant. This is my service provider tenant because here I have my customer open. This is my service provider tenant, and this is where Lighthouse, this is where Sentinel is configured. So now I'll go to Sentinel service. And in the Sentinel service, I will click on create. I am actually looking forward to onboard the additional 2 workspaces that customer has created, and customer has informed me to also include them in my in my security monitoring services. So I'll click on create. When I click on create, I should be able to see those 2 workspaces. And this is where they are. You can see here, customer 3 and customer 4. I'll switch the screen. See, customer 3 and customer 4 I just created. Now those 2 workspaces are visible in my service provider tenant in my Sentinel. So I will quickly add those workspaces also. So I'm adding the customer 3 and then I'll add the customer 4. So my customer 3 is added. You can see I can go and add customer 4 also. And you can see these workspaces are Azure training subscription and sandbox subscription. So because of Lighthouse, this is possible. My ID has been given access on the client subscription through Lighthouse, and I'm able to manage that subscription and how many client tenants I have got access that I can verify from by clicking on my username and then hit switch directory. Here I'll see all subscriptions that I have access to. So this is my default subscription as we speak, because this is where I work, but I have access to these subscriptions also. My level of access is contributor, hence I can see everything in these subscription and manage it also. And from this portal view itself, now let's look at the other aspect of Lighthouse. This is for the Sentinel, but it is not only for Sentinel, it is for everything. If I type workspaces here, if I type log analytics workspace here, in my view, I'm one of the service providers employee. Now, if I look for log analytics workspace, I can see all the workspaces. The one that belongs to my tenant, my subscription, the one that belongs to my customer's tenant and subscription. Why? Because it says subscription equals all. Here I can select the subscription. If I say that I only want to see information of my tenant, then I'll select my subscription and it will only show me the information of my tenant, which is 3 test workspaces and 1 Sentinel log analytics workspace, the one which is the main workspace. If I say that I want to see everything of my customers also, I can hit apply and I'll see everything. So basically, I can manage my customers' resources from my tenant using Lighthouse. Now you know that this customer 3 workspace belongs to the customer, right? See, I'm able to see everything here. I can do anything. I can change the setting of this workspace. I can configure anything of this workspace, which actually belongs to my customer from my view itself. Because view is secondary. Main is resource that I have access to. So this is another aspect of Lighthouse. You don't only use Lighthouse for Sentinel. You use Lighthouse for managed services also. Instead of gaining guest level access to the customer's tenant, which brings a lot of security risk, we always recommend to deploy Lighthouse and then grant managed service provider employees access to customer's tenant. And Lighthouse is a free service. There is no charge for it. So this is the safest and easiest way of managing services as a managed service provider. And when it is Sentinel in picture, it becomes managed security service provider. Okay. So now that I have been able to onboard, I go to my Sentinel and you can see that I have all the workspaces here, which basically belongs to my customer, which is visible from this subscription name. You can see here, these first 3 workspaces are part of my subscription. And the last 4 workspaces are part of my customer subscription that is visible from the subscription name. Now let's say I want to manage incidents for my customers' workspaces. So what I'll do now in 3 and 4, customer 3 workspace and 4 workspace that I have just deployed, there is absolutely nothing. They are completely blank. But customer 1 and customer 2 workspaces, they have some log sources configured. So I'll select customer 1 and customer 2 workspace and I'll click on view incidents. So this is how I can see incidents of my customer's workplace, customers access here. Now there is no incident in last 24 hours. I'll go last 48 hours. So it doesn't show any incident because incident has not been created. But if I want to see the logs, I can quickly see the logs. For example, let's say now I'm writing an query for this. So I would rather go to Sentinel. I'll select my workspace, Sentinel log analytics, which is my main Sentinel. So I'll basically click on my main Sentinel here. And let's say I want to see the logs. I can see the logs here. So I'll go to incidents here. I look for the incidents. And these incidents that you see here, if I show you one of the incidents, delete private endpoint for a resource. If I click on the incident here, you will see this incident is from my customer's tenant. This is my customer's tenant incident. These 2 incidents, they are from my customer's tenant. Because here you see the account name, the ID 7126. You can see here, this is the subscription ID of my customer. I go to my customer's tenant. This is my customer's tenant. If I go to the subscription ID here, you can see 674581B0. And if I see here 674581B0. So by looking at the subscription name, I will be able to understand and look at the storage account, sample storage 703. If I go to my customer's tenant and if I look for storage accounts here, I will see these storage accounts here. Now we have actually removed everything just to save cost. So these storage accounts would exist actually here. So this basically incident is from my customer's tenant. Now I'll show you another thing. So I'll go to I'll go to the analytics rule here. And let's say I want to query, so I can quickly query here. I'll go to edit and I'll include my customer's workspace. If I'm just doing threat hunting, I can just use the query to hunt for threats in my customer's workspace also. Or if I'm writing a permanent analytics rule, then I can use union operator. I'm saying the process remains the same that I described before we went on break in the morning. The process is the same, nothing changes. The only thing that changed here is how have you onboarded cross-tenant workspaces belonging to your customer using Lighthouse. That's the only thing which changed. The query, nothing changes. In the query, you will just need to type the same thing. Union workspace, you just need to type the workspace. Let's say I want to get the information of the other workspaces also. I'll just copy this query, edit. I want to write a query for all the workspaces in one go. I'll just do it like this. And now I'll change the workspace name. 4, 3, 2 and 1 is already there. I'll add the comma. You just need to make sure of the syntax. You should not break the syntax. That's it. So my query is here. Now I'll click on view query results. And there is some error that I have done, which is workspace Sentinel not.azure activity. Workspace customer 2, customer 3 workspace. Did I make some error here? Okay, no problem. I'll just run this query here. Okay, the challenge is my 3 and 4 workspace is not in this manner. Maybe I've done some error. Let me show you. Let me see the name. Workspaces is customer 3 workspace, customer 4 workspace. Okay, let's close this for a moment. I'll not make any changes here. Okay, that was the error that I did actually. So the last one does not require a comma actually. Okay, see, now I run this query. I'm not running the entire query, but I can run like this. So when I'm running this query, I'm actually looking for Azure activity logs on all the workspaces, and it will populate the result. My 3 and 4 workspace is something that that customer has just created, and then I have just onboarded them into Sentinel. They don't have any log sources configured, so definitely there will not be any activity log from those workspaces. But the remaining 3 workspaces, which is my Sentinel log, which is my own workspace, and customer 1 and 2 workspace, that will show me the query. That will show me the activities. So you will see the activities. Now, how will you know the activities belongs to which workspace? These are the fields and the columns from where you can see the information. So you can see the information here in the column fields. This is the ID that you can see here. You can see a lot of activities here. Test user 1. So wherever it says test user 1, this is your own workspace. You can see all the information here, all the queries here. And in the queries itself, and see you can add subscription ID. You can see the subscription ID here. The subscription ID differs. So these are This is the subscription ID 7247. Then you will see some activity logs for 81B0. You will see some activity logs for other subscription also. So that's how you will see. You will see here, this is for 7247. This is for 7645. So 7247, 7645, and 81B0. They are three different subscriptions. So I'm actually getting activity log for Sentinel log workspace and customer 2 and customer 1 workspace. If I only want to run the query, let's say for one of the workspace, I'll remove the additional workspaces from this query. I'll delete this. And I'll run the query now. It will only show me the information for first two. So that's how I can use my analytics rule. Now I'm getting the information for first two. So the process remains the same. Once the workspace starts to reflect in your Sentinel, then the process will remain the same for Sentinel operations. The only thing that is additional here is the Lighthouse part to onboard the tenant of the customer and then onboarding the workspace from customer's tenant into your Sentinel. Now understand what customer is doing and say, is customer also using Sentinel service? If I go to the customer tenant, this is my customer tenant because here I see customer 1, 2, 3, and 4 workspace. If I go to Sentinel service here, this is what you need to understand. If I go to Sentinel service here, you can see in the Sentinel service, customer has all the workspaces 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? And if I click on any of the workspace, customer can also see the incidents of that workspace. Incident that has been generated in the workspace. Probably maybe there is no incident in the workspace 1. Let's go to the incident of workspace 2. Customer will be able to see all the incidents of the workspace also over here if there are any incidents in the workspace. But does customer has any analytics tool, any data connectors here? No, customer doesn't have anything here. So basically, when you now this Azure activity log customer has enabled itself, that is why the activities are going there. So basically here in the customer Sentinel, the one thing that you need to remember here, which is something new, I would say this is where a lot of confusion comes in the people, which is his. So for example, if I in the customer's tenant, in the customer's tenant, if I add another, let's say these are the workspace in the customer tenant. So I'll remove. Let me do it this way. Let me create one more tenant in the customers, one more workspace in the customer's tenant. So I'm creating one more, which is customer 5 workspace. Okay, so now my customer has, you can see here, my customer has additional tenant, which is customer additional workspace, which is customer 5 workspace. Okay, now let's say I go to my Sentinel and I'll run a query once again. Now this is where you need to look carefully, guys. So customer has just added a new workspace into its subscription, into its tenant. Now I'm trying to run a query, and what I will do in the query, I will also include that new workspace. Which is this customer 5 workspace. I'm adding it here. Okay. Now I run this query. See, I'm running a query to fetch Azure activity logs from 4 workspaces: Sentinel 1, customer 2, customer 1, and the new workspace that customer has just created, customer 5. Let's see what happens. I'm getting the result. I'm saying it is giving me the result here. It should give me an error actually. Let me query the result here. Okay, it is not giving me the error. I noticed that. So basically what happens if you run a query for a workspace that has not been added to Sentinel, you will not get the results of the query. It will give you an error. It will say that the workspace needs to be added to Sentinel, without which you cannot run the query. Now, there are two options that I have here. This is my managing tenants workspace. This is my service provider workspace. If I go to the service provider Sentinel, you can see here in the service provider Sentinel, I do not have that 5th workspace that customer has created. Is everyone with me on this? That 5th workspace is not added right now. Yes, no, maybe. Yes, you need to say, you need to acknowledge, otherwise I will not know whether I'm being heard or not.
Yeah, Raghu, it's not added.
It's not there, right? Because that has been not added. But if I click on create, I will see that 5th workspace here, because my tenant has access to the customer's tenant. So I can see all the new workspaces that customers onboards, and I will be able to onboard them in Sentinel here. However, this is something new update that I could only see yesterday, which is even I can do this from here also. If customer goes to log in the customer's tenant, this is customer's tenant incognito. This is the 5th workspace. In customer's tenant, if customer clicks on Sentinel service, and if customer adds that 5th tenant here, that tenant will be by default reflecting in the service provider's tenant also. So customer is adding 5th tenant into the Sentinel service, which is configured in customer's environment. So see, the 5th tenant is added into the customer Sentinel. This is customer Sentinel, and 5th tenant is also added here. Just refresh the screen for a moment. Okay, you can see the 5th tenant is added here. Now, if I go to the service providers dashboard here, this is my service provider subscription. If I go back to the Sentinel, I will also see my 5th tenant already added here. This is one update that I could notice yesterday. Wait, you see here, I refresh the screen, my 5th tenant is added to the Sentinel. So what is happening here actually? What is happening here is that the Sentinel that I am using to manage customers' workspaces, Microsoft has also created an instance of that Sentinel in customer's environment. Using that instance, customer will only be able to see the incidents of its environment, but analytics rule, logic apps, and workbook will not be displayed to the customer. So customer will only be able to see the incidents of its environment, but not the anything else. That is something new that I have, noticed yesterday when I was deploying it, something which was not available in the past. So Sentinel has added the capability for the customer to see incidents of its environment in its Sentinel itself. And service provider is any which ways managing it. So now service provider now the customer will not depend on service provider to provide him a report of all the incidents on periodic basis, customer himself can select all the workspaces and click on view incidents, and customer will be able to see all the incidents of its workspaces here itself. That's the beauty of Sentinel that I have seen. But does it mean that customer is paying for Sentinel? No, absolute no. Customer is not paying anything for the Sentinel, because customer will only pay anything for the Sentinel when customer has configured some data connectors, when customer has configured an analytics rule to basically analyze the logs. So customer has not configured anything. Customer only gets the Sentinel service by default configured in its tenant when customers' workspaces are managed by some service provider, and customer will be able to see all the incident of its tenant related to its workspaces in customer's Sentinel view, and there is no charge for it, because customer's Sentinel is absolutely doing nothing other than showing a passive view of the incident. So customer only sees the passive view. Customer cannot respond to those incidents. That response capability is with the service provider. It is just a passive view that Azure, that Sentinel has added for the customer to view things in real time, but in a passive manner. No modification rights are given. This is something new that I have only discovered yesterday. So this was about the Lighthouse. This is how you manage the affair. This is how we manage all of these use cases that I was talking about. So 3 use cases I covered today, which is centralized workspace, which was done. So we covered 3 use cases: customer having multiple workspaces, and the other 2 use cases, I'll write that use case here itself, the use cases that we covered, which is all Sentinel. There is nothing above and beyond Sentinel that you can think of. Customer has multiple workspaces. These are the 3 main use cases. So customer has multiple workspaces. Customer has additional workspaces from across tenant in the other tenant, and customer has workspaces in the other tenant, which is MSSP case, which is when you act as an MSSP. So the process remains the same. This is all about Lighthouse and the configuration, guys. This is a great tool. Sentinel, to summarize, is a great cloud native SIEM solution that brings unlimited possibilities, that provides in-depth analysis, that provides all the capabilities that you need as incident response team or managed security service provider for your customer. So this concludes the Lighthouse part. This is all we do. This is how we manage the tenants. And as I said, all you need to do is just make modifications to your query in your primary tenant, primary Sentinel console, to accommodate the workspaces of the same tenant or across the tenant, and accordingly you will see the results. And when you act as an incident responder, then in your tenant, in service provider tenant, you can select all the workspaces in one go, and you will be able to see the incidents. You can select all the workspaces in one go like this, and you can click on view incidents. It will show you incidents across all the workspaces. There will be a column with the name workspaces through which you will be able to segregate the incidents across customers, across tenants, and you can manage incidents. The logic app part will remain the common. The only thing that you need to make sure is whatever account you have configured in the logic app for the authentication must have appropriate rights to take action on the service, on the data source. That's the only thing. Nothing changes. Then comes workbook. Workbook also doesn't change. Workbook will remain the same. Some workbook will change, some will not change. So for example, if I go to workbook part, the dashboarding part, you can see if I go to the workspace usage workbook, which is a great workbook, this way you can always send reports to your customer. You can give them information in terms of how the log ingestion is happening, how they will pay. So here in the workspace, you can select the subscription. For example, I want to see what is the log ingestion, what is the type of ingestion, or how much is the ingestion for a specific customer. I can select the subscription of that customer, like Sandbox subscription. Then I can select the workspace of that customer, for example, workspace number 5, which we have just created a couple of minutes ago. You will see the information of that workspace. Absolutely, you will not see anything here because we have just created it. But if you select the workspace 1, you will see some data flowing in for workspace 1 because we created it yesterday. And you can see in workspace 1, there are two tables, Azure activity and operations. Azure activity is not billable. It is free of cost. Operations is also free of cost. So there is no charge for it. But here's the amount of data. Almost 1 MB of data is in Azure activity. And you have some data here also. So this is in bytes, 189 bytes. So this workbook is common. Irrespective, you can see this information for all the customers. However, if I go to any other workbook, for example, if I go to Azure Activity Workbook that I have saved here, if I see this workbook, here I will only see the activity logs for the main, for the main workspace that I started my training with, which is Sentinel Log Analytics. Here I will not get an option to basically filter the workspaces. There is no option here. You will only see the activity logs, Azure activity logs of the same workspace, which is Sentinel log. So what it means? It basically means that if you want to see the workbook for your customer, there are two options. Either you deploy the workbooks for the customer in customer's tenant. So you navigate to customer's tenant and you deploy it here in the customer tenant itself for the specific tenant. For example, customer workspace 5, here you can deploy a specific workbook for it. Or you deploy the workbook in your own tenant for this workspace. In both ways, you and customer will have visibility because if you deploy it in the customer's tenant, then customer will have added rights. If you deploy it in your tenant, then customer will have passive view. That's the only difference. So workbook needs to be deployed separately because Microsoft has not yet expanded the workbook capability across tenant for some of the workbooks. So whichever workbook does not show you information of all the workspaces or the specifics of all the workspaces, you will need to deploy that workbook separately. And workbook is a free service. There is no charge for it. So you should not bother about cost. It is just an administrative overhead and additional configuration that you need to do. But you also understand that we deploy workbook once and then we don't configure it again and again. It's one-time configuration. It hardly takes 2 minutes. So every time you onboard a new customer, you will need to spend some efforts. You will need to spend some time in modifying the analytics rule, the existing one, or creating a new analytics rule for that customer, in deploying workbook for that customer, and in making changes to your existing playbooks to accommodate that customer also, or writing a new playbooks altogether for that customer only. That is your decision, whether you write everything from scratch for the new customer that you onboard, or whether you make use of your existing IPs. Now, this is where another concept that you need to be aware of, which is very important, which is IPs. Managing IPs. IP stands for intellectual properties. Intellectual properties is basically something that you have created from scratch, something that you have created that you have not copied from anywhere. You have actually created. That's your IP, intellectual property. So how do you manage intellectual property in this case? Because what will happen tomorrow when the contract is over with the customer, you would definitely want to segregate your resources. So the best practice for MSSPs is to create and manage IPs in its tenant, which basically means as an MSSP, you should create and manage IPs in your tenant, which basically means to configure everything in your tenant for your customer.
which is if you are writing analytics rules, if you are writing hunting queries, if you are creating workbooks, if you are writing logic apps, do everything in your tenant so that when the contract is over with your customer is not taking any intellectual property or any information from you. That's the best practice for managing IP. However, if you are building anything in customer tenant, let's say in customer tenant, you have created some logic apps because you don't want to pay the cost of it, or you have created some custom analytics rule in the customer's tenant, then this is customer IP. You will not be able to put your claim on it. This is customer's IP. So this is what you need to be aware of also, because no customer is permanent. Do not make efforts on a customer for which you only have contract for 1 year. Try and use your IPs, try and build and evolve your own IPs so that you can continue to use them in the long run. There had been a lot of conflicts in the past between customer and service provider because of this. Because what service providers did, they basically created IPs in customer's tenant. And when the customer was leaving, what customer did, customer quickly, went it to tenant and removed the access. For example, this is the customer tenant, right? I'll go to this tenant here in the subscription. I'll go to the subscription here where my service provider has access. So I'll click on view access this resource, and my service provider and I did not go well. I'm saying customer can remove it from here also, or customer can directly go to my service provider. This is service provider offer. Customer can select it and delete it. This is how customer can do. Customer can select all and delete once. The moment it is deleted, service provider will lose complete access to customer's environment, and whatever IP service provider has created in customer's environment now belongs to the customer. And that's where the dispute is. So I had been part of a couple of disputes when the contract did not get renewed. Customer was able to claim or retain the IPs that belong to the service provider. So never ever create any IP in customer's environment, because customer may take access, may revoke your access at any point in time. So that's the another thing that you need to be very careful about. Otherwise, you will lose your IPs and you cannot claim as your IPs, because now it is part of customer's environment. Customer can reuse them. So, for example, for initial 1 year, customer gives you managed services contract, and customer sees how you are doing it, and customer makes a note of everything. Then customer hires its own engineers, and its own customer builds its own SOC, hire people, and then customer starts to use. Then one fine day, all of a sudden, customer removes your access and hands it over to their SOC team to manage the environment, because they have all the IPs, they have everything configured in their environment. So to avoid this, please make sure that you are not granting access to customers, or you are not creating IPs in their environment. Otherwise, you will be in big trouble somewhere down the line. So that was the last thing that you need to be aware of. Okay, so this was all about Sentinel. I will take a pause here and see if you have any questions.
Hello, Raghuveer.
Yes.
Yeah, Raghuveer, can you please show like how to create tenant in this environment?
How to create tenant in
Yeah,
which environment?
in our Sentinel or in this Azure.
How to create tenant?
Yes, another tenant. Can we create another tenant?
Yeah, you can create another tenant. I will say you just need to navigate to the Active Directory. I have global admin access on the Active Directory. This is my Active Directory. And here you just need to click on add, and there is an option manage tenant. Sorry, click on manage tenant here, and there is an option to add.
Okay, to create here.
You can create a tenant, an Active Directory tenant or B2C tenant, business
And
to
what is the basic function of this cross synchronization of cross tenant synchronization? There is one option in this Azure also.
Cross tenant synchronization means that you get access to the other tenant.
By default, tenants are isolated. They do
Mhm.
not talk to each other. Tenants are like two employees of two different companies, DXC and HCL employee. They don't talk to each other. You introduce them with one another and they start talking to each other. That's what tenant is.
They are basically for accessing purpose.
No.
So
Tenant isolation. See, there are two people. They are wearing the same dress. They look alike the same. What differentiates them is the ID card. One ID card says HCL, the other ID card says DXC. So you know that this person is from HCL, this person is from DXC. So tenant provides separation. They provides identity, isolation. Because if tenants can talk to each other, then one customer can see the resources of other customer. How will Microsoft manage multiple customers and ensure segregation of resources? Via tenant. So when you sign up with Microsoft, you get a tenant. When somebody else sign up with Microsoft, that person gets a tenant. Now your resources are part of your tenant and his resources are part of his tenant. That's how Microsoft is managing multiple customers because it's a public cloud. It's for everyone. So by using tenant, by using subscriptions, by using resource ID, Microsoft is managing the segregation between different customers. That's the purpose of tenant.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, all right. Now, guys, I just pasted a URL in the chat window. I would request you all to go through this assessment. It has 26 questions. They are simple questions. It's open book test, and those questions, have multiple choices, 4 choices, and they all are part of the syllabus that we have completed, that we have done in this training. And I have been considerate in terms of putting them at a level where you all can try. So those questions, some of those questions are, I'm saying all of those questions are simple. They involve the information that we have covered in this training, and I have kept in mind your current level and the distribution of the team, that some are in engineering, some are in operations. So let's go ahead and attempt those questions. This is just for your internal consumption, so that you will know how much you have learned in this training, how much you have gained, and how much you need to prepare more, how much more efforts are required from your end. So let's go ahead and do this test. And after this test is done, you will need to there is another URL that you see there, which is which is for the feedback. If you feel that I have really done well in this training, I have really added value to this training, and you have really learned something, something new, or your existing knowledge on Sentinel has now been upgraded to many-fold, please give your feedback. Please give your honest feedback. And if you feel that I could have done something better, was a scope of improvement, please feel free to include that into your feedback. That will help me to, that will help me to deliver future trainings by incorporating those feedback. So that is a humble request. So 2 expectations from me. Go ahead and do this test and provide the feedback. While you are doing it, I will go ahead and upload all the documents that I need to share with you. And once this is done, I would need 5 minutes of your time to explain you what those documents are and in what scenarios you will be using those documents and how they will help you in future. So let's go ahead and do this test first. If it is blocked by Zscaler, what you need to do, you need to disable the VPN in that case. Mitchell, disable the VPN, then it will work. Okay, I believe Rishant has typed the complete URL. Thank you, Rishant. Yep, when you click on the complete URL, you will be able to open. In the test, when I open it, I can see your email ID option. So you just need to type your DXC email ID, guys. No personal email ID is needed here. Just type your DXC email ID. It basically have email ID field once again, which says participants email ID. Type the same. Yeah, type the same email ID there also. And in the test, you just need to select the radio button against a response, whichever you feel is the right response. All right. Best of luck, all of you. Meanwhile, I'll upload the documents in the folder.
Yeah, so Raghuveer, one more question. So this is not related to Sentinel, but let's say we want to integrate Azure to any on-prem SIEM solution. So what are the components you suggested to we can integrate?
I actually discussed that in the training session, but I will tell you once again. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay. There is also a question in the MCQ related to that. If you want to integrate Azure Sentinel to an on-premises solution, understand your objective, whether it is inflow or outflow, whether you want to send logs from Azure Sentinel to on-premises solution, or you want to ingest logs from on-premises solution to Sentinel. Tell me what is the use case.
You mean my question is?
Okay, so what is the use case? You want your existing solution to receive logs from Sentinel, or you want your existing solution to send logs?
No, I was not talking about Sentinel. I was talking about the Azure subscription. Like if you want to integrate Azure, I mean, customer to on-prem SIEM like ArcSight, and customer infrastructure is in Azure. So that was the use case. Yeah.
Okay, for that, ArcSight may not have direct visibility to Azure services. For example, activity logs, Azure AD sign-in logs. So ArcSight may not have direct visibility. What you can do, you can create a workspace in Azure. This is the simplest method. Create a log analytics workspace in Azure, ingest all the logs in that log analytics workspace. Okay. And then stream the logs from log analytics workspace to your ArcSight. That's the simplest method of doing it. Or there is another way.
Okay.
You can use Defender for Cloud to ingest logs also. So Defender for Cloud. Now what you need to do, Defender for Cloud needs a workspace and Sentinel needs a workspace. Use a common workspace for both Defender for Cloud and Sentinel, right? Then what you need to do over here where it says security solution, you see an option that says scene. Just click on add here and you will see the process. So you just need to create an event hub. Event hub is the streaming service in Azure. Using event hub, you can stream all the logs to a third-party SIEM solution. For some solutions, you have a connector available. For example, ArcSight, there's a connector available. Here's the documentation that you made reference to. This documentation contains answers to all your questions. It is also there in my session transcript. So this is the documentation. And to answer your question, whether ArcSight is compatible with it, yes. See here, ArcSight is hosted in Azure. No, ArcSight is out of Azure, but you have a ArcSight smart connector available. So using that smart connector, you will be able to ingest logs into ArcSight from Microsoft Azure, from all the services of Microsoft Azure, which includes Azure Portal, which includes Microsoft 365, which includes Dynamics, which includes SharePoint Online, which includes all the services of Azure. You will be ingest logs. You just need to go through this document. This document provides step-by-step guidance for it.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Give me 1 minute, guys. Let me quickly upload the data. While I'm uploading the data, I would request you once again to share the feedback. That is very important for me. Yes. Okay, I am removing the existing session transcript, which is there in the Google Drive. And I am now uploading the final transcript, which contains all the data from day 1 till today. And don't consider this transcript as the final version of what we discussed in the training. It does not definitely contain everything, but it gives you a high-level overview of what all topics were discussed on a specific day that will help you to connect and find those topics and that specific reference in the session recording. That's the ultimate goal of sharing this transcript. It's a rough version, so you will find no indentation, no proper marking, no proper arrangement. That's a rough version that I was using throughout the training. Okay. And other than this, now I'm putting some documentation. So the first document is Sentinel use cases. This is an internal document from Microsoft, which is not available on public domain. I am sharing this document. This document contains all the top use cases of Sentinel that you can configure across all these services like Azure AD, Office 365, virtual machines, Microsoft Intune, AWS, SQL Server, Analytics, IoT, all the use cases are there in this document. The other is long-term retention, which is already there, which I uploaded probably day before yesterday or prior to that when Yogesh was requesting for it. So it contains all use cases when it comes to long-term retention of data. Then third is my session transcript. My session transcript contains all the topics at a very high level. And in the end, the URLs for what we discussed today. So there are 4 URLs here. Microsoft Sentinel Wiki, which is the GitHub for Microsoft Sentinel, one-stop shop for all the references. How do you extend Microsoft Sentinel across workspaces and tenant? How do you manage multiple workspaces and tenants in Microsoft Sentinel as an MSSP? How do you onboard a customer to Azure Lighthouse? So this is the Lighthouse document. This is the Lighthouse GitHub, which basically includes other Lighthouse capabilities also other than Sentinel. And how do you protect your intellectual properties? So this has all the information. You have my contact information on WhatsApp and LinkedIn. I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn and be part of your professional network. So you can connect with me on LinkedIn also. So this contains the session transcript. Then I have, now this is the latest version of the book. This is the version 2, which was released in November 2022. And this is the technical playbook for MSSPs. I would say if you are acting as a service provider, managed security service provider, whatever information I've shared with you so far, yesterday and today, that how a managed security service provider should deploy Sentinel, all of that information plus additional information is available in this playbook. This is an official playbook from Microsoft, so you can trust the information for its authenticity and accuracy. And this has all the information that you need. Then there is another document, which is one of the Sentinel expert. This is one of the Sentinel expert company that I am also associated with. And this is the second edition, which is the latest edition of the book. You can read this book along with the technical playbook, MSSP technical playbook. And this book also contains great piece of information that how do you need to manage Sentinel? What are the deployment best practices for Sentinel in a customer environment, in as an individual or as an MSSP? This is a great piece of information. And the last is the SOC use cases that I was discussing. This list is comprehensive. It contains all the use cases that you may think of to configure in a SIEM solution. So these are the documents that I've uploaded. I've not uploaded any presentation. There is a reason for it because presentation might be out of date tomorrow, day after, or 1 month down the line. And that is why I kept on sharing the URL from Microsoft documentation for all the topics that we covered throughout the training in the Microsoft Teams chat box, because those URLs will always be up to date. Even if there is a change that happens on the URL, the URL will continue to remain the same. So whenever you are configuring anything, refer to the URL instead of looking for a presentation. Presentation may have outdated information. Cloud technology is very dynamic. It changes a lot. So you should always have reference to the most up-to-date documentation, which is Microsoft documentation. And that is why I've shared the GitHub, I've shared the wiki, I've shared the documentation from Microsoft. I have also put a documentation in the chat window, a URL, which is a bit old URL, but the information that it contains is is up to date, which is related to Azure Lighthouse deployment guidance. This is for 2019, but this still contains the right information. So Yogesh, you were asking, how do I deploy Lighthouse? Here's the information. So you basically need to get this information, and it also shows how do you get the object ID, how do you get the directory ID. You can run these PowerShell scripts quickly to get the information. Once you have it ready, all you need to do is to run this query, and then there will be a template that you will create, and you see the template you also see the template here. So you just use this template and you will be able to deploy the Lighthouse in the customer's tenant. So the document is from 2019, but the information that it contains is still applicable till yesterday. I'm saying last night I deployed everything just to show you demo, and I used the same documentation. So it has all the information that you need with respect to configuration of Lighthouse from the Sentinel perspective. And this also have references to the most recent documentation from Microsoft. And here's the reference. This is the reference. This will take you to the most recent documentation, which is from from this year, which is how do you publish managed offer. This is related to Lighthouse. Onboard customer to Azure Lighthouse, which is from May this year. And this is the most recent documentation. But this documentation also contains the same script, same guidance, which you see in this documentation. So this is for the Lighthouse. So that's on the documentation. Any additional documentation that you guys need on Sentinel or anything, just drop me a note. If I have access to it, I will definitely share with you. That is all from my end. We already have gone 13 minutes over and above this session. Let me know if you need if you need any additional input, if you have any additional question. Else we will close the session, and I wish you all the best in your Microsoft Sentinel and Microsoft Azure cloud learning journey. Keep in touch.